to talk about COP26 and the carbon sink, more than just a pretty place. So we're talking about COP26 and grasslands as a nature-based solution, but COP26 more broadly, and how we can all engage with this important international event that is coming up in November. So this is part of the Fall into Nature series that Plantlife is running to engage our members and wider audience on the work that we're doing to promote the protection of wildflowers and fungi across the UK and internationally. So just as an introduction to myself, I'm Honor Eldridge. I'm a policy lead at Plantlife. I specialise on grasslands and farming policy more broadly. And I am part of the COP26 team. I was lucky enough to go to COP21 and COP22, so I've got a little bit of experience here, but I'm pleased to have some incredible people joining me today who've certainly got more experience, more expertise and knowledge to share that will hopefully be a very interesting session. So just a little bit about Plantlife at the beginning. Plantlife is a charity that raises the profile and celebrates beauty and protects the future of our wildflowers and plants. From meadows to mountains and road verges to our gardens, we're working across the UK to save wildflowers, plants and fungi. I'd also probably add to that, we're working internationally as well with our international plant areas and our partners across the world. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that I can introduce our incredible panel. So today we are going to be joined by India Stevenson, who's the Assistant Editor at the British Ecological Society, John Verdick, who is the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy in the US, and Randy Hayes, who's the Executive Director of Foundation Earth in Washington, DC. Now, you might notice that Randy isn't actually appearing on your screen just yet. That is because he is traveling at the moment and hopefully going to be joining us from inside an aeroplane, which is a bit of a no-no when it comes to international climate, but I think it's part of the realities that we all live in. I think he's got some really great insights that will be willing to share with us shortly. So just hoping that he is able to connect shortly. So as my colleague Felicity, who is monitoring the chat, has just put in, please add any questions that you have for the panel and use the chat function for any comments that you have. We'll be trying to do a Q&A at the end of the session in order to get through those questions, but please ask them throughout as they come up and across your mind so that we can keep track of them and then ask them at the end. So I'm going to hand over to India shortly to just start with an overview of how the British Ecological Society has been working to create a guide for people to engage with COP. Because the COP26 is an incredible opportunity for global leadership on climate change, with world leaders gathering in the first 2 weeks of November in Glasgow, with the UK government hosting. But that gives this incredible chance and opportunity for the British public to get involved. And so I'm going to hand over to India to give us an overview of how that can happen.
Thanks, Anna. I'm just sharing my screen. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me today, and thanks Plantlife for organising this really great webinar series. My name's India. I work at the British Ecological Society, which is the oldest ecological society in the world. So we have members all over the world, and we wanted to create a guide for our members to give them the background to this climate conference coming up next month, why this particular conference is so important, and also how to get involved. So I'm just going to go through the key points from the guide now, but I've also provided a link to it in case anyone wants to read the whole guide or use it as a teaching resource. So to understand the background to COP26, you need to look at the history of climate legislation. So the first big climate agreement was the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this provides a framework for global efforts to address climate change. It was negotiated at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, and 196 countries signed the agreement. So the ultimate aim of the UNFCCC is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous human interference with the global climate system. And this was intended to be achieved in a timeframe that would avert threats to food production and allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change. Countries also pledged to reduce their emissions to 1990 levels, submit inventories of their emissions, and financially support developing countries' climate action through grants and loans. So the UNFCCC is a parent treaty to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, which you've probably heard of, and they are both agreements to implement the UNFCCC. So the 1997 Kyoto Protocol was the first agreement to implement the convention, and it provided legally binding obligations for 37 developed countries and economies in transition to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 5% compared to 1990 levels. It also introduced what's called flexible market mechanisms. So that allows countries to trade in emissions and earn emission reduction credits through projects carried out in developing countries. However, it was criticised, especially by the US, for not setting reduction targets for high greenhouse gas emitting developing countries. In 2012, there was the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol. So that governs a second commitment period. As the first commitment period was seen as a success, countries increased their commitments to reduce their emissions by at least 18% compared to 1990 levels. So that took us through to 2020. But in 2016, what you will have heard about most recently was the Paris Agreement. So COP21 was held in Paris. And on Earth Day in 2016, 197 countries signed, pledging to keep global average temperature rise to as close as possible to 1.5 degrees and well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the Paris Agreement requires countries to set targets, which are called nationally determined contributions, on how much they're going to reduce their emissions. And countries are required to make their targets more ambitious every 5 years. This is called a ratchet mechanism. And because it's now been 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016, 2021 is a really important year because countries are going to have to make their targets more ambitious. And the Paris Agreement was different from the Kyoto Protocol because it required both developed and developing countries to submit targets. So many countries have now pledged to reach net zero by 2050, including the UK. The Paris Agreement also had countries pledge to adapt to the impacts of climate change and foster resilience to future climate scenarios. So this involves enhancing greenhouse gas sinks such as forests and oceans. So I've just included the timeline that we included in our guide here. So you can see in 1824, the greenhouse effect was discovered. The first climate conference was held in 1979. In 1988, the IPCC was set up to analyze climate data. And then you can see climate legislation increasing as atmospheric carbon is also increasing on this timeline. There was a dip in emissions last year due to the pandemic, but earlier this year, emissions were returned to pre-pandemic levels. And it's all leading up to COP26 in November. So what is COP? COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the supreme decision-making body of the UNFCCC. It meets once a year. So all states that are parties to the convention are represented, and each time they meet, they review its implementation. So decisions are made by consensus, which differs from a majority voting process, and it means that any party can block a decision from moving forward. So that means that often the lowest common denominator solution is the one agreed upon. Why is it in Glasgow? Well, the location of COP rotates along regional groups of countries who take it in turns to choose a host. The UK and Italy won a bid to host COP26 in Glasgow, and pre-COP talks were hosted in Milan last week. It's actually the biggest international conference the UK has ever hosted. It's expected that there will be over 30,000 delegates. And it's really put pressure on the UK to show climate leadership, which has called into question some recent decisions, such as the approval of the Cumbria coal mines. So what's on the agenda? Well, as I said, parties are required to submit new nationally determined contributions and increase their climate action ambition. The rules for carbon markets. So this means parties are going to discuss how emissions can be traded between states and between companies. This is quite a contentious agenda item that has been brought forward from previous COPs. Nature-based solutions. So how can ecosystems and agriculture be used to enhance, to be used as carbon sinks? So this is the first COP where nature-based solutions will be discussed. Countries will be discussing how nature-based solutions can be integrated into strategies for climate mitigation. The loss and damage mechanism. So this will be providing compensation when a party can't adapt to the impacts of climate change. So when countries are suffering losses to livelihoods and land, which is already happening. So this is a really important agenda item. How can you get involved? Well, now is a great time to get in touch with your local politician and voice your climate concerns. It could be particularly effective to write a joint sign letter from your organisation or institution. During COP, it's too late to volunteer at the conference, but there will be an unofficial programme of events taking place across Glasgow. And protests outside the green zone is thought they're going to be up to 300,000 protesters. There'll also be protests around the world, especially on the 6th of November, which is the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice. So that's a date for the diary. And finally, the hashtag for the conference is Together for Our Planet, and people are being encouraged to share their positive climate actions online. After COP, there's just a quick plug here. So the British Ecological Society is hosting a symposium next year on the climate science for ecological forecasting, joint with the Royal Meteorological Society. And that's going to bring ecologists and climate scientists together to discuss the future of our planet. So that's the end of my talk there. I've left my email address at the bottom. If anyone wants to get in touch, I'm happy to share the guide. And with that, I'll hand back to Anna. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That's really interesting. And I think it's really helpful to see that sort of sweep of where we started and where we've got to, and to get a sense of how this COP really does demonstrate momentum towards that nature-based solution narrative, and how far we've really come. Sometimes it's a bit difficult to keep hold of the positive and see that we really have made some progress. And so it's really helpful to see how we are starting to recognise the value of nature-based solutions within this. I do know that India needs to go, so I am going to say thank you very much, and just wanted to very quickly say first, just before I let you go, how optimistic are you feeling about this COP? Do you think we're on the right path? Do you think we're going to get some success, or are you feeling a bit negative and hesitant about this one?
I'm feeling very optimistic. I think especially with the UK hosting it and it putting pressure on our government. I think now people are finally taking the science seriously. So yeah, I'm feeling good about it.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you very much for joining. Really appreciate it. So now it would have been to hand over to Randy Hayes, but I think unfortunately he hasn't quite managed to either board his plane or connect in just yet. So I'm going to hand over to John next, and hope that if we give Randy a few more minutes, he might be able to join. So I want to introduce John Verdick. He's the Director of International Climate Policy at the Nature Conservancy in the States, as I said before. In this role, John works to improve policy coherence between international climate change rule set and national level action in the land sector. John formerly worked at the US State Department, where he negotiated work streams related to forests, carbon markets, and the Paris Agreement rule sets for nationally determined contributions and greenhouse gas accounting. John also manages the TNC's work related to the International Civil Aviation Organization, appropriate for Randy, and their carbon offset protocol, and the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, $1 billion fund for reducing deforestation. So now let me hand over to John.
Thanks, Honor, and thanks so much for having me here, and appreciate the chance to talk about it. You know, it's an exciting COP this year. We've been waiting a year and a half for it because of COVID, and I think for so many of us, we've been waiting to see what's going to happen at COP, and we're finally going to have a chance to meet. So it's exciting. I think there's a couple different things going on in the last. COP26 was supposed to be a year ago, and as India mentioned earlier, nationally determined contributions were due for most countries, or a lot of countries, last year. So over the last year and a half, we've seen new NDCs rolling in, rather than all of them come in at one time, which would have made it a little easier to count up everything and see exactly where we are. It has rolled in over time. Some countries, because in Paris in 2015, they used a 5-year NDC, other countries used a 10-year NDC. So there's a little bit of disparity of who had to come forward this year and who did not. We've seen countries like China provide additional information on their NDC without updating it, because there's kind of a legal piece there. But we've seen one of the most exciting things as I look at this year that I think gives me hope for COP26 is we've seen the US is back in the game. A year and a half ago, we were looking at a very different United States under a different administration than we are now. We've seen China update its information and provide greater ambition in their NDC. We've seen the EU come forward with a new NDC and UK actions upon it. At the same time, we saw all of a sudden Canada came forward during the Earth Summit, the Earth Climate Leaders Summit. Japan did. And so in a way, like, you're seeing everybody kind of coalesce. And one of the hardest things within the climate negotiations is everybody's looking at each other, because there's so many economic impacts to countries that are related with this. No country wants to step forward all by itself and let the other countries not do something. So there's always a little bit of everybody looking at each other and wanting to do this, and you have to build trust. So, seeing the United States come back in, basically, I think the first day of President Biden's administration, he submitted the forms for the United States to re-enter the Paris Agreement, whereas President Trump had removed the United States from the Paris Agreement. Important piece with that, though, too, is that the United States never pulled out of the UNFCCC, which is the treaty body. It pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is why one president was able to pull the US out and the other president was able to put the US back in. So for now, that's good. If there's a new president, that could be trouble again, right? The in-out could be really troubling for a long time, in the building trust nature of all that. But with that, we saw the United States put a good NDC forward. We've seen UK increases ambition in the EU. We've seen many countries start increasing their ambition. The bad news at the same time is we saw an NDC synthesis report about a month ago from the UNFCCC saying we're nowhere near on target to get to the 1.5 degree measure. So we've got a lot of work to do. So where does that lead us going into COP this year? COP, the UK presidency has a couple key elements that it wants to focus on, which are, there's an adaptation and resilience chunk and work stream they're going through. They have a nature work stream, an energy transition, a clean road transport, and a finance. Now, this year, it's not so strange to see nature as one of the top 5 elements going into a COP, but 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been extremely strange to see nature that high on anybody's political list. So, for many of us here, looking at plants, looking at nature, looking at forests, et cetera, we've kind of all of a sudden got into the inside of the big game, which is wonderful. Now is our opportunity to further push that out. Just to look at what else we're going to need to see COP. We're going to see some more countries, I expect, put a new nationally determined contribution forward, but many of them just did earlier this year when they were actually supposed to. So I don't think we'll see quite as many of those as some hope. just knowing that 9 months ago or 12 months ago, many of them did. But what we do need to see is we're going to see a lot of corporates, I think, making pledges as well too. How do these corporates that are starting to look at their net zero pledges? And then there's another piece, which is finance. In the Copenhagen year in 2009, there was a pledge for $100 billion per year by 2020. Well, 2020 is obviously past us. So before 2025, we need to have a new agreement on what the next $100 billion target is. And that target in the Copenhagen Accord was from both public and private sources. So seeing what the corporates are going to put forward, seeing what the governments are going to put forward from their overseas development aid, these are pieces that are all going to have to build up into a package where we're going to see, a push for more ambition on greenhouse gas emission reductions, at the same time an elevation of climate finance, are kind of two sides of the same coin. The finance, I think from India's mention earlier, what can you do? I think, talking with local politicians, I think we saw earlier this year, the UK actually lowered its percentage of overseas development aid that comes out. Not a great year for UK presidency for the climate negotiations to have done that, but maybe that's a piece that we can push back in and make sure that gets elevated. Other countries as well too, and making sure that there's the finance push. Talking to local politicians, it's not just countries that make these pledges. It's how countries actually bundle the greenhouse gas emission and adaptation targets together. But many of that comes from under mayors, under governors, under different political systems as well too, at a subnational level as well. And then, as I look at TNC's goals going forward into COP, we are looking how to build out some of the existing Paris rule book. We heard the markets provision earlier from India. There's some pieces there of who can trade, who can't trade. How do you measure that? Who gets to actually control that system? Shares of proceeds if there are trades. All these different components go in. So we're trying to make sure that there's very high quality trades that are going to happen and that they're very transparent is a piece for us. On a separate negotiation stream called transparency, the greenhouse gas recording protocols coming out of basically IPCC guidance says countries need to have a greenhouse gas inventory. We want to make sure this is as transparent and as robust as possible. One of the weaknesses of the Paris Agreement was that it didn't have legally binding numbers for countries, right? Countries have to submit an NDC, but it doesn't say what number they have to do. And it doesn't say if they don't meet it, that there's any teeth that can come back and have a punitive effect. So how do we solve that? Sunshine, right? Which is the transparency negotiations. What, is this country's tons, looking at the entire agriculture, forest, land use sector coming into that? We need to know what everybody's doing so that the world knows. And then we have a chance as citizens to kind of lobby, advocate for more. And then one other piece, as we look at it too, there's kind of this inside COP and outside COP going on at the same time. There's a chance for all of us to lobby, to advocate, and push for more ambition from across the world. There's also what's going on in the text negotiations. The entire kind of nature element, the agriculture, forest, land use, greenhouse gas emissions sector is already in the Paris Agreement, right? And you have Article 5 looking at all sinks and all sources, including, RED plus. All sinks and all sources does include basically all these greenhouse gas sources. So we're in, which is the good news. Article 6, there's some countries pushing to exclude that from trading, for different reasons. So we from TNC are trying to make sure that nature is part of everything that comes out of COP, whether it's the finance piece and that a good chunk of the money goes to nature related elements. We're trying to make sure greenhouse gas emissions are very transparent, and we're trying to push for greater ambition and that sort of thing. So I'm happy to answer a lot of questions later and dive back into any of these elements, but let me just stop for there and turn it back to you, Anna.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think one of the questions that we have had in the chat, which might be helpful just to pick up right now, is whether you could explain a bit more about carbon trading, the kind of concept behind it, and how it fits in with the UNFCCC's discussions, and then we can maybe pick up some of the others at the end of the session.
Sure. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the markets provision, and there's kind of 3 different subsets within it that look at different components. And 6.2, Article 6.2 is basically it basically is a carbon market provision that's looking for trading across everybody, making sure it's transparent, but everybody could trade anything that is a ton of CO2 equivalent, and figuring that out. Article 6.4 is basically the former CDM, and bringing what is from Kyoto Protocol of what we saw earlier of the former, Kyoto was developed and developing had different rule sets and different abilities that developed countries could purchase these emission reductions from developing. But now that developing countries have targets in their NDCs as well, it kind of changed that and shook it up. So we see some that want to keep 6.4, some that want 6.2 to look more like the new Paris Agreement. And 6.8 is a slightly different, it's a non-market mechanism in the markets text, which, only a UN negotiator could love the idea of that kind of stuff happening, and happen probably from some trade-offs and that sort of thing. But with the carbon trading, there's a couple important things going on, which is if you include, if you want to trade a ton, did it have to be in your NDC or not? And part of this question comes up, think of a developing country that put in maybe half of their territory in their NDC because that's the best they could do, but they're also maybe doing deforestation work in another part of their country that's not covered by the NDC. Can you geographically do that or not, right? And it is in the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions versus is it in the NDC? Some countries have a full inventory but didn't put the entire inventory into an NDC. So we're trying to figure out kind of that scope. There's also a question, a share of proceeds is a big one from some adaptation colleagues, and basically in an adjoining room saying, hey, if there's going to be a whole bunch of carbon trading, make sure 1 or 2% goes into adaptation measures as well too, instead of mitigation and carbon trading, just shuffling things around. And then, as I say, shuffling, one of the main things we're trying to do is make sure that every emission reduction is real. If something's going to be traded, we want to make sure that there was actually an emission reduction that happened. The first trades under Article 6 provisions happened about a year ago between Switzerland and Peru. And so we're starting to see some of these early trades happening. The full guidance isn't out for Article 6, but we probably have about 80% of the guidance that we need. And we're kind of arguing over the last 20%, which is very tricky, but it has enough that Switzerland and Peru were comfortable making a trade. And so you have this corresponding adjustment that happens, that if one country, moves, buys something and adds it to its NDC to say it's being more ambitious, we need to make sure that there's a debit and a credit happening at the same time so that we're not just shuffling tons around.
Thank you, that's really helpful. We'll pick up the Q&A in a bit, but I am just going to speak for a short moment about what Plantlife's ambitions for COP26 are. So many of our members will know that grasslands has long been a kind of core priority for Plantlife, and we've been working on promoting species-rich grasslands, whether that's in public lands or home gardens or on road verges. And so we are looking to promote species-rich grassland as a nature-based solution at COP26. And so how do you define a nature-based solution? So the IUCN defines nature-based solutions as actions that protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So you can see how grassland really could be a core way to deliver a nature-based solution. And so that's what our Plantlife team, including myself, will be doing when we're in Glasgow. And to just continue from what John was saying and what India's point was, the UK government has been very clear that they want to see nature as central to COP26, and they are looking to tackle the biodiversity crisis with the climate crisis together. And so the Day of Climate Justice on November 6th is also the Nature Day that they have designated in order to highlight how nature can be part of a climate future. And this is coming from the top. This is something that Boris Johnson has really been emphasizing in his public communications around this. And he is seeing himself, presenting himself very much as a green leader and demonstrating repeatedly that he wants to be seen as fighting for the environment. Part of this is against a backdrop of Brexit and the idea that he wants to strengthen UK leadership against previous iterations of the COP being dominated by European voices as the sort of climate leader. So when we're talking about species-rich grassland as a nature-based solution, globally, 34% of land carbon is stored in grasslands, which makes them a very powerful carbon sink. In grasslands, 90% of the carbon is held in the soil, and just 10% is held in the vegetation and the plants. Yet much of our global grassland soils has become degraded. And so we really need to work to restore soil health and draw atmospheric carbon down from the atmosphere and locking it away in the soil. Permanent species-rich grassland absorb and store more carbon than monocultures of rye. And so we really need to invest in healthy soils and restoring, maintaining and protecting our species-rich grasslands. So now I actually have a short video that I'm just going to share. I can pull it up. Make sure everyone can hear my sound, which I think you can. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we're going to be focused on for COP26 and our engagement there. Unfortunately, it looks like Randy still hasn't been able to join us, which is such a shame. I will just continue for a bit longer just to raise some of the kind of key points that he had wanted to stress. And you'll have to bear with me, I'm afraid. So Randy was very keen to emphasize how in previous iterations of the summit, there hadn't been that focus on nature, and how with each progressive COP that we had, there was more of a recognition on the importance of nature, but also on biodiversity and how those two things need to be integrated across and integrated together in order to build a future that was addressing both biodiversity and climate at the same time. It's a shame that he hasn't been able to join, because I think he could have added some real colour to some of the stories and iterations since he was there and had been fighting and protesting and being arrested in many of them, but hopefully he'll be able to join a future one. If I can just pick up on some of the other questions that we had, and maybe John and I can just chat it through for a bit, if that's okay. So I think one of the biggest hurdles that was previously considered was getting the US to join back into the Paris Agreement and to return that commitment again. Now that the US has joined the Paris Agreement again and is going to be actively participating in COP, 26 in Glasgow. Do you think that that is the sort of biggest hurdle to overcome? What do you think the next real challenge is that we need to address if we're going to meet that target?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important to have the US back in. I mean, the current second largest greenhouse gas emitter not being part of it, and the historical largest emitter not having that country as part of an entity that's negotiating how to reduce emissions for climate change. It just doesn't work. It's back in, and I think going forward, the most important thing is going to be implementation of NDCs. Each country is actually implementing its NDC a little bit different, and these NDCs really just started in 2020. So countries put forward their pledge back in 2015, 2016, but they actually started in 2020. So one of the biggest things that I'm seeing that's very different is corporates are also coming in and starting to show what they're doing as well too. And many of those started in 2020. Those big kind of numbers that we've started seeing come out and reducing emissions in their own supply chains. And I think that's because we're finally getting the policy and rules right under Paris Agreement. And so hopefully that's where we start seeing more companies come through and saying, okay, now that we actually know what the rules are, we'll start to go as well. And then, one other piece that we're seeing, we've seen a lot of language recently about coal phase outs. Most of this has been international support for coal. But how do we start seeing countries cut their own domestic coal at the same time? It's very easy for every country to agree what everybody should do, as it doesn't have complete responsibility. But what are they doing at home, and making sure they're kind of walking the walk? And then one quote to just throw in there too, because I saw it the other day and thought it was great, is with the United States coming back in, I think Winston Churchill had this quote of the Americans do everything right after they've done everything wrong first, or something like that. I paraphrase it wrong, but it does show that there's a lot of hits and misses. But I think when you have a large country like the United States moving in the right direction, it really helps. On the other hand, at the same time, when it moves in the wrong direction, it really hurts.
I think that's really helpful as a way to phrase it. And I think it's amazing to me to think back to 12 months ago. We were sitting here all waiting globally around the world for the result of the US election, and that feels a million years ago. In some way, that's great relief, but I think in some ways it still means that we keep up the urgency in the fight and the attention on what we can all do as citizens and individuals. And I think one of the questions that came up that I was kind of interested to hear your perspective on was, we set quite a bold target in Paris to keep within a 1.5 degree limit. And there's been a lot of concern about whether that's even feasibly possible at this point. Should we really be talking about achieving a 1.5 degree limit, or should we shift our thinking and really just be focusing on talking about 2 degree or even 3 degree mitigation? Do you have a perspective on that? Do you think we can still keep to 1.5?
We hope so, and I think we need to keep trying. On the other hand, in Paris, when those two numbers of 2 degrees and 1.5 were out, there was speakers from different countries saying, we're looking at the trends and there's no way we're actually going to make 1.5. You guys all know that, right? And so that discussion was already being had and kind of in open microphones, which means everybody kind of knew it, right? And which is bad news. The good news, how do we not point ourselves at 1.5 and hold ourselves to that? I think we have to, and that's what we're, all of us that are climate activists have to do that as well.
I think one of the things that we've been focused on, and I've been focused on in my work around grasslands and farming policy more broadly, is this idea that of land sparing versus land sharing, and this idea that you can have this sort of increased intensification of food production in one area if that allows for rewilding in another space. And certainly Plantlife's position that actually you need to see a land sharing approach where you have more sustainable food production that has a lighter footprint, both in terms of nature impacts, but climate impacts as well. And how do you do that in a way that ensures that we can have good quality food that is accessible to all people, but also that it isn't damaging the environment? I think that's a slightly different context when you're talking about a UK specific territory and the sort of relatively small island that we're on versus the US and a much larger expanse of space where you've got, you know, protected public lands that really are managed in a land sparing approach. Is there any thoughts that you have on that, on how that sort of feeds into nature-based solutions being implemented in the US across public lands?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just put a link into the chat for everybody. There's we call it an NCS mapper, but it basically takes global data sets and has used this to, you know, look at the different, what we're calling pathways. Some of them are forests, some of them are wetlands, some of them are agriculture, and grasslands is in there. And how do we look at the best basically action we can do in each country? You know, what is right for Mongolia is not right for Brazil, and that sort of thing. And we need to look locally. We need to see, you know, at the frontier of the forests, what are we doing for forests and what are we doing for grasslands? You know, what are we doing to make sure that we're looking at the biodiversity constructs and overlaying that as well too? And I think from the United States, we saw the new NDC that came out this year from the US, and it was to reduce, it's a economy-wide target to reduce emissions 50 to 52% by 2030. Within that is included the agriculture, forest, and land use components as well too, but they did not break it out throughout those segments. They've said they will, and I'm expecting them to actually maybe announce, you know, what is energy, what is the transportation number, what is the Afalu number, and that sort of thing at COP. But, you know, even in the United States, it's so big. What happens in the southeast of the United States is very different than what's happening in the Southwest, where it's very, you know, drought in California and all the wildfires we're seeing. So the US overall has about a 13% annual sink of greenhouse gas emissions from the land sector. If things go wrong, that sink is going to go away, and the US isn't going to make its target, but it's also going to lose all these lands. So they're looking at it. You know, there's a lot of programs that are going on to reduce it, but I think, you know, same with the UK, right? Everything that we can do better, and we can do more of it. And how do we scale up what we're doing well at a small level, and how do we make them bigger and bigger, because 1.5 is going to require it.
I think one of the questions that's come up in the Q&A, which I think is interesting and links to something that I was going to ask as well, which is, you know, individual national governments have their own priorities, they have their own personalities, let's say. And so how do you work to ensure that it is equitable and just, and that those leaders are representing the best interest of the world as a whole, while balancing their own priorities of their individual nations? And I think that question kind of resonated with me when we were talking about the difference between developed and developing. How do we make sure that it's equitable and fair globally, while recognizing that each nation is different and has different priorities, has different industries, it has a different historical perspective on climate change, and how that all feeds in together to building a sustainable global dialogue around it.
Yeah, I think, you know, that broad ideas, it's what caused the idea of the nationally determined contribution portion, right? And for developing countries to come into the Paris Agreement and actually take a target onto themselves, they said we need flexibility. And so what we've done is we are pushing everybody to do their most, and making sure that, you know, if we're going to aim for 1.5, we need, from developed to developing, we need everybody doing their best. We try to use a lot of data that we can, and every decision we make hopefully is science-based, going into then what policies can we use based off that science, you know, and in the idea of, you know, what is, sorry, what was the language you had? It was great. It was sharing, intensifying, rewilding, like where do we make the best decisions and how, but then how do we expand that? So one of the pieces with this is in an NDC, developed countries actually have to do an absolute reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Developing countries have some flexibility that they can use a business as usual projection, which is based upon how do they see their numbers going up over years, what are economic assumptions that are going into development over the future years, and then what does that line actually look like? So it could be a BAU target versus an absolute reduction. That's one of the big pieces of flexibility. Now, at the same time, you know, and I was negotiating back in these days, we wanted that flexibility to be there because we knew it was real, that a least developed country just could not do the same as one of the most developed countries, and that's not fair. At the same time, you don't want some countries to be able to have a provision where they can just opt out of trying and opt out of reporting. And so what we kind of did is gave some flexibility in the NDC guidance, while at the same time trying to be very strict in the greenhouse gas inventory, so that we made sure that everybody is reporting on everything that they were doing. So there was this kind of sunshine clause. So that, and that kind of legally changes, because one of the hardest things, and India had it in one of our slides earlier too, which was, the US always had a hard time with some large developing countries who had really high greenhouse gas emissions not having a target in Kyoto. And that was one of the biggest reasons the US legislature never signed Kyoto, and it stuck. But there's also a piece where the rules for the Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 that develops in developing countries, where those lists were made back in the 1980s of who was on the OECD list. And so you have countries like Saudi Arabia, with a GDP per capita higher than, almost any country in the world that are still developing countries and are not required to be a developed. You have Singapore is still on that list, South Korea, development has happened. And so how do you create an agreement that is flexible for more than 10 years or 20 years? You have to have some kind of thing that shifts.
That's fantastic. That's really helpful. I think one of the things that India spoke about when she said, now is the perfect time to sort of contact your MP and to contact your representatives globally, and also raise that idea of the days of protest and how you get involved. But a lot of this can feel very daunting and overwhelming, frankly, pretty technical and wonky to some people. And they want to get involved and they want to reduce their carbon footprint and understand what's going on, but it can feel like it's maybe outside of their comfort zone or knowledge base. I think that in some ways that kind of focus on the impact that food can have on your carbon footprint has been an extension of that, because choosing different food for your supermarket shop can feel like a very tangible way to reduce your carbon footprint. And I think people are understanding more and more the environmental impact and carbon footprint of what they buy. But I think it would certainly be interesting to hear from your perspective what it is that people can do at an individual level to get involved with COP26, but more broadly than that, what they can do in their own lives to help reduce the climate impact and help tackle climate change.
Yeah, I think the top line answer in that is advocate for more everywhere you possibly can, and do everything you possibly can in your own life as well too. Make better food choices, drive less, ride your bike more, all the things, recycle better, and advocate for better recycling. Many of our communities say they recycle, and then you put something in the recycle bin and you find out it doesn't get recycled. Actually, I think it's a pretty common thing around a lot of countries. Advocate at your local level, because all these local decisions often they often have land use repercussions and greenhouse gas emissions repercussions. Advocate for your country to do more on ODA. And one of the biggest changes I'm also seeing in the last probably 10 years that I've been kind of looking at this is the public knowledge of climate change has increased dramatically. It's a common thing for everybody to know about climate change, versus 10 years ago, it was kind of a wonky thing even still. That's good, but we need to drive it even bigger.
And then last question before we wrap up. So I think, rightly so, there's a lot of emphasis on COP26, this big moment globally, delayed a year, an extra year of build-up and anticipation and excitement for it. A new president that's going to bring us back in, a prime minister who wants to stand up on the stage and scream about his green credentials. But what happens next? What happens after COP? How do we keep this momentum to build it and growing afterwards, so that we can take this energy and this enthusiasm and really deliver change post COP?
Yeah, I think this is COP26, so it's one COP has never solved climate change, and this COP won't either. On the other hand, we're seeing dramatic momentum changes, and both from the private sector and from the government side, and we need to keep driving it forward. Next year, COP27 will be in Africa. We've seen Egypt has raised its hand and is working within the African group to, the African countries will decide which country gets to host it next year. But how do we drive from the UK and push into the next African COP and make sure that these countries are implementing their targets better, they're reporting better, there's more finance going into it, and just more awareness publicly that's pushing and saying, without everybody doing more, we're not going to get to 1.5 degrees.
There's a question from Tim in the chat that relates to the Nature Conservancy's work on the International Civil Aviation Organization's carbon offset protocol, and how effective this is, how effective the protocol is in itself, and is the offset effective in delivering against that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Tim, if that's not a good summary of your question.
That's good. Sorry, I was just trying to scroll back up to it too. But generally, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the whole reason it exists or has a climate component in it is because countries only have their own national targets, right? So what happens when an airplane flies from the US to the EU? And so much of this actually started back, a decade ago when the EU threatened in the WTO to charge a carbon price, and the United States and China went ballistic. And then the result, though, is the EU basically got this idea pushed into the ICAO and said, well, figure out something or we're going to keep this idea of ours. And so you got a negotiation, and there's 3 ways that airlines can reduce their emissions to meet these Civil Aviation Organization targets, one of which is, just wing and fuselage improvements that we're starting to see airlines use less fuel. They can make fuel changes, not totally ready for mass market yet, but we're starting to see some biofuels and that sort of thing come out that look promising for the future. And then the other portion is the carbon credits piece. And so the carbon credits are, there's a whole system going into it, which, some of the language and some of the negotiators are the same people that are doing Article 6 right now in the Paris Agreement. And, we're really hopeful that some of these emissions reductions and the airlines are making their own pledges to reduce emissions, but at the same time, some of the money from them buying their offsets is hopefully going into the large forest basins. It's going to Congo, it's going to Indonesia, Amazon, et cetera, and starting to build some action on the ground. One hard thing that happened in the last year is the baseline for which year airlines used just got really messed up because of COVID. At the time the baselines were being figured out, all of a sudden COVID changed and there was no airline emissions. So which year do you use? And so there's kind of an active negotiation of, do we go back to the previous baseline and, assume 2020 is a blip? Or, some would like it to be much easier and say, oh, let's just use our, we want to use our highest year and we'll just exclude the outliers statistically. Don't worry about it. And so we're at a spot where obviously we need to worry about it. It's statistical, but how do we build it in?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring the session to a close and say a very big thank you to John, who certainly filled the session well and was really interesting and brought a great perspective. I will again thank India and Accenture, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for Randy to join a future session for Fall into Nature. But I'm sure everyone on the webinar will join me in saying a big thank you to John. So that was great.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks all.
Thank you.